Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality and clinical practice. I'm your host, Doc Bach, and I'm here with my co-host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and today we will be continuing our series on narcissism. So we've talked about what narcissism looks like when it's good, and also when it goes sideways into pathological land. So within pathological narcissism is narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. So while not all pathological narcissism is the same as narcissistic personality disorder, those diagnosed with NPD will have a heaping dose of pathological narcy. So join us today as we unpack the 9 DSM criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD.
We previously discussed where narcissism in general came from, but where did narcissistic personality disorder originate?
That is a great question. All right, so a super brief history lesson. The word narcissism comes from Greek mythology, where the god Narcissus was cursed to fall in love with his own reflection. The story contains excessive love of self paired with lack of empathy towards others. Then we have writers in the late 1800s referencing narcissism as an erotic condition, right? Because of this excessive self-love. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So there's an impairment in the love department because the love of self is so great, it actually impedes real intimacy.
Okay, so the self becomes the object. So the self is attached to and loves the self to an extent where they're constantly in pursuit of pleasure, like in all areas, like self-love.
Right. If you catch the drift. Pleasuring the self. All of the pleasure. You get the point. So in the 1910s, Otto Rank linked vanity and admiration of the self with narcissism. Freud also picked this up in the 1910s and forward, first viewing narcissism also as an erotic condition, as previous theorists did, but then expanding it into personality. And an important note is that Freud mentioned narcissism can be both normal and necessary, not just pathological. He would.
Of course. Now, in 1926, Reich discussed a phallic narcissistic character, which mirrors today's NPD. Again, how fitting. Later, narcissism focused on achievement and took on various names such as the Don Juan character in 1945 and the Nobel Prize complex in 1966. Then the big dog strengths like Kernberg and Kohut helped solidify the definition of NPD when we first had it in the DSM-3. So that was the first time it made an appearance.
So interestingly, it's also important to highlight that from about 1966 to 1995, research articles on NPD were less than 10 per year.
Wow.
So the researchers that looked into this actually described NPD research itself as dead for nearly 30 years.
My goodness.
Yes. So this is relevant because the literature on NPD is still mostly based on clinical experience and theory as opposed to empirical research.
Right. I imagine research is hard for that population. Calling all narcissists, we want to study your flaws.
No.
Maybe if it was marketed as like whose male anatomy is the biggest, they'd have more volunteers.
There's a suggestion. Calling all people trying to find a dissertation topic. There you go. There you go. All right. So what about the books that we use to make the diagnosis of NPD? So let's fast forward a bit to 1980. The DSM-3, as you said, was when personality disorders first came on the map. Interestingly, narcissism didn't really have empirical research backing, And the first iterations of NPD had some different wording than it does now, but original definitions were still based heavily on psychodynamic theory, which basically were the OGs, the OG shrinks, the original guys.
Yeah. Now, in another manual, healthcare professional used to diagnose the International Classification of Diseases, ICD for short, NPD has no historical origin until the 11th edition, which is 2022. And that's different from other personality disorders that showed up earlier in that.
Okay, so NPD didn't have a presence there until 2022. Good grief. Okay, so it sounds like Narcy has been the redheaded stepchild of empirical personality research. But don't worry, it's gained a lot of attention even still, and we still have a lot to learn about it. And I would argue possibly need to rethink the way that we classify it.
I agree.
But it's still incredibly useful to understand the diagnostic language, which brings us to our current DSM's definition of narcissistic personality disorder. How does someone receive such a diagnosis, Doc Fish?
Sure. Like all personality disorders, these symptoms need to be pervasive and like widespread, basically. And it's a pattern that begins in early adulthood and is present in numerous contexts. It needs to consist of kind of like three main things. One, grandiosity and fantasy or behavior. So fantasy, like it could be imagined or dreamed of. Now, let's define grandiosity. APA's definition states it's an exaggerated sense of one's greatness, importance, or ability. In extreme form, it may be regarded as a delusion of grandeur.
Ooh, that is so interesting. Okay, so a delusion of grandeur is the false attribution to the self of great ability, knowledge, importance or worth, identity, prestige, power, accomplishment, or the like. You get the point, right? Also, this is called a grandiose delusion, or what some might term as megalomania.
Ooh.
Very interesting.
Quite.
So earliest theories of narcissism actually conceptualized it more in the psychotic realm. So syndromes out of touch with reality. Fascinating, right? So we have the potential erotic disorder and the potential psychotic disorder. And then eventually we landed on this is a personality disorder.
Right. My goodness. Well, going back to that grandiosity definition, the quality of seeming impressive or important in an artificial or deliberately pompous way, or pretentiousness.
Sure.
It can include being imposing or impressive, or even being more complicated or elaborate than necessary. Now, why? Well, because there's a need for admiration.
Exactly. So the pursuit of being seen as an object of esteem with others, giving them the approval and respect. Or, in other words, essentially wanting others to fawn over you or see you as important. And then, of course, with that, its buddy is lack of empathy.
So empathy is putting yourself in someone else's shoes, or like perspective taking. It's like vicariously experiencing what the other person is thinking or feeling or perceiving, and maybe sitting in someone else's pain with them and caring for them all the while.
Sure. So those with NPD are so self-absorbed that there's too much self. There's not room for others' feelings. Only mine.
Right. But that's like the framework that we're looking at with NPD. So now we actually have to meet at least 5 or more of the following criteria.
Yeah.
And we grouped criteria not in chronological order from the DSM, but with like internal deficits first. So internal, outward. So our first internal deficit is really important because it's actually mentioned twice in the DSM. We literally just talked about it. Lack of empathy. So they're unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others.
Yep, exactly. This one's very important. Again, mentioned twice. Kind of like BPD with impulsivity was mentioned twice as well. Yeah. Essentially, they can't tolerate any of their own badness, so they split it off or project it outward and onto others. They haven't learned perspective taking and or find others' perspectives too dangerous or irrelevant to their ego or agenda. So they're either unaware of others' thoughts or feelings, or they just don't care. And then sometimes empathy is rejected because others' feelings and dependency are seen as a sign of weakness.
Okay, so this maybe might look like making hurtful remarks in which they're completely clueless about, or again, they just don't care.
Right.
So maybe bragging about money in front of someone they know is struggling financially, highlighting their own health in front of someone who's terminally ill. And because of this, they can come off as emotionally cold and disconnected, like only interested in themselves and no one else.
Yeah, exactly. Callous. Like who are you? How could you say that to this person? I think it's important to note that this is like not in an autistic type of way. Like this is not autism. So they just don't care, those with NPD. They're too busy with their own self and keeping up their own image to have time for you and your emotions. Versus in autism, there's social hardwiring issues that are rooted in development. These are not the same thing.
Okay, as you were talking, I was thinking almost like a teenager or like a regressive form. Their social hardwiring's intact. They just like haven't really gone through that growth yet. It's like still all about me. And there's like a kind of like a cluelessness in that, but their hardwiring is intact. So research actually shows us that there is a difference.
Ooh.
In Germany, they had a study with 3 groups. So MPD patients compared with borderline and then also a control group. The MPD group had less emotional empathy, but not cognitive empathy.
Oh, interesting.
So they have like some degree of cognitive empathy. So that means that they're able to understand another person's perspective on an intellectual level, but they lack the emotional empathy. So directly feeling the emotions that another person's feeling.
Right. Okay. So this also flies in the face of autism. Like they can detect the cues on a cerebral level, but the emotional, like mirroring, that emotional feeling of understanding what it's like to sit in someone else's shoes, doesn't come easily.
Correct.
Which can also lead to what's called alexithymia or emotional blindness. So again, not the same as autism. Those with NPD can detect the cues on a cerebral level. They just don't typically care unless it benefits them.
Right. And then, so another study, they actually found a neuropsychological basis for this.
I would guess that they found less connections in the brain regions involved in empathy or empathic functioning, mirror neurons, something like that.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And in a third study, this is super interesting. NPD patients actually performed worse on facial emotion recognition tasks, specifically fear and disgust.
Oh, wow. Those are really primitive emotions, more like hindbrained reptilian brain. Interesting. So that says social mirroring is off, that they don't perhaps recognize fear or disgust in others because it's too threatening to the ego. So the brain doesn't register it. So that's the personality brain connection. Like the body isn't registering it because it's too threatening psychologically. It's a whole body process.
Right. So that hardwiring is intact. There's a capacity to, but it's too scary for the inside and the ego. So they just deny it.
Like ignoring the warning light on your car.
To the point where like you just don't even know it's there anymore because you've seen it so much.
Wow. Blends in with the wallpaper.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yep. So lack of empathy was the first criteria. Now the second one is envy. So they're often envious of others, or they believe that others are envious of them.
Of course. Yep. So they're envious of others' things, achievements, praise, believing that they deserve them more. So, as a reaction, they may put the other person down, devalue them, or otherwise undermine the other person. They tear them down,
Right.
essentially. And then they desire stuff in that pursuit of specialness, or think that they're so special that others desire their stuff. Possessions, achievements, qualities, money, power, etc. You get the point. But then they become preoccupied with those things because of that envy. And as I'm even saying this, I hear a hint of paranoia in that.
Ooh.
Yeah. So if you're so preoccupied with others being jealous of you, like, wouldn't you think that people are out to get you and then hoard your things?
That's a good thought. Yeah. So this is internal. But then there's also this internal grandiosity that can show up in more external behavior. So what you were just saying, there's like paranoia or maybe like being preoccupied. And that's the third criteria actually, is preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, ideal love.
Right. Because in order to fill their void of emptiness and present as superior, they need something to fill it up, right? So this stems from low self-worth that is rejected. So essentially what you get is an overcompensation for the emptiness.
Right. They may obsess or ruminate about admiration or maybe privilege they think is like long overdue. And, you know, they often find famous, powerful, influential people that they can compare themselves with.
Yeah. Or rub shoulders with. Yeah.
So this leads us to the fourth criterion. So they have a grandiose sense of self-importance, which means they might exaggerate achievements and talents or expect to be recognized as superior without the achievements that match up.
Exactly. Yeah. They've learned that their worth is superior and not necessarily tied to effort. So then, in an effort to disguise the fact that nothing is there, they resort to bragging, exaggerating, overestimating their abilities, and holding unrealistically high expectations. So then they come off as boastful and pretentious, and then expect other people to see that same reality that they do. Like the expectation that they're going to have that reality reflected back, or their greatness, their great abilities reflected back. And then taking the glory for themselves. So not letting other people have even a slice of it. And it's all vibrato though, right? And this serves to prop up this illusion of amazingness. But there's nothing there. Or if it is, it's not as great as they project it to be.
But they believe that they're special. Okay, so this is criterion 5. So they believe that they're special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high status people or institutions.
Right. It's almost like rubbing shoulders with those that are influential, wealthy, talented, you know, the like, almost like vicariously absorbing the specialness of others. Like, these other people have really high value, so I have high value in their presence. Like, their specialness rubs off on me. Like, we're all in the special boat. Like, just like static electricity, right? Like, oh, that rubbed off on me. Now I'm special.
Right. But they can be devastated or surprised when others don't give them the admiration they think they deserve.
Exactly. In other words, they don't understand when others don't recognize their greatness, even if it's like greatness by proxy,
right?
Which essentially is rubbing shoulders with the person of status. Like, if that person of status weren't to recognize their greatness, they would potentially be devastated or surprised by that.
And so we're focusing on like status, right? So it's very likely that they need the absolute specialist, top, best person or organization for all the things, like restaurants or hotels or their hairdresser, or a teacher or a physician. And if they're disappointed by that top person that they chose, they'll devalue them and tear them down.
Yep. I'm the best, so I need the best is the mentality. Like, I have to have the best suite in the hotel, the penthouse, right? Oh, that wasn't good enough. There was, I don't know, a tiny hair on the hairdryer. Give me a new suite. I want a poolside penthouse view. Like it just never ends, that voracious appetite for more. Or I'm just thinking of like, like, oh, I have a degree from X Ivy League school. And it's like, oh, but you have a PhD from Harvard. That's not good enough. Like, putting down the things that are like, are you serious?
Yeah.
Are you serious right now? That's ridiculous.
I was thinking like, well, I'm paying you. So I have the power and I know better than you do, even though you're the expert in the field.
Ew. Oh my. Yeah. Yeah, that can happen. Oh, or like in business, like someone who keeps changing the terms of the contract in their favor. Like, again, this is very childlike. Like, think of a kid that's cheating at Go Fish or Candyland. Like,
that happens.
Right. It's a thing. And as a kid, it's like, okay, this is developmentally appropriate. You're like teaching them not to do that. But in business, those with NPD can absolutely cheat and change the terms to be in their favor. Yep.
Right. Okay. So now this leads us to criteria that kind of pull on those external factors to meet needs.
Okay.
So criteria number 6, they require excessive admiration.
Right. So they need an audience desperately. Like they need applause because that sense of self is so fragile and there's such deep self-doubt and intense self-criticism. So they pull on other people to tell them who they are, to prop up that false image. And then they might ruminate also about like knowing what others think of them. So there's an image protection happening there. I have to protect my image. What is everybody saying? Or even like information that someone might have on them. Like this can also look like paranoia. What are they saying? What do they know? Because you can't be found out. You can't let the world know who you really are or who they project themselves to be. It's like an ego hologram,
Okay. I love this quote from the DSM. It says, they may expect their arrival to be greeted with great fanfare and are astonished if others don't covet their possessions. They may constantly fish for compliments, often with great charm.
Right. Like we did not have pyrotechnics going off when you entered the office for therapy. So maybe that wasn't good enough.
They're devastated.
Oh, goodness. But yeah, on a serious note, I have seen that with those with high narcissism or with NPD. Yeah.
Yeah. Which transitions us to criterion number 7, a sense of entitlement. So like unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with his or her expectations.
Again, they are super important and then expect this unreasonable, favorable treatment. Like going on an excursion with a friend, maybe taking advantage of that friend in the process because of that entitlement. Like, I expected you to taxi me to the spa and to the resort and to the tanning bed and to the shopping metropolis before dinner at the country club. Oh, you wanted to go in? Like, we can't have that. Like, you can't stop and use the restroom. I have to get to dinner. Or they might feel angry or confused if not given what they expect. Like, I should be at the front of the line because of who I am. Why should I have to wait? Or like, why is this drive-through so slow? Why is Chick-fil-A closed on Sunday? Like, don't they know they'd get my business?
Right.
Or I shouldn't have to wait in line. Like, these are the notions of someone with NPD because they're so important.
Right. Or like, I own you. You need to overwork and be completely dedicated to me. Like, you don't have a life. I am your life. You have to work on holidays to show loyalty. Like, why would you be with your loved ones? And this can lead to knowingly or unknowingly exploiting others.
Right, right. Sometimes it's not even conscious.
Yeah. It's like, they're not even trying to do it on purpose. It just is.
Yeah. Versus other times it is on purpose. It depends on how bad the NPD is.
Yes. So this brings us to the external criteria. So the criteria that we can kind of see more. Criteria number 8, we just touched on, they're interpersonally exploitative. So they take advantage of others to achieve his or her own needs.
But it's one-sided. So then relationships are for self-enhancement. Of self-esteem, emotions, status, image, success, intellect, financial stuff, ego cookies, like the list goes on and on and on. It's one-sided, just like a child. And then they can undercut other people as well. Like, ooh, free latte on the counter, must be mine.
Oh.
Or like in a big corporation, forcing the algorithm to give them a raise versus the person who actually deserves it. Yeah. And again, this can be conscious or it can be unconscious. They may not be aware of what they're doing.
Right. I like this quote from Milan's book. So the narcissist expects to be given whatever he or she wants and needs, no matter what it might mean to others. This does not include active deception, but rather is a consequence of the belief that he or she is entitled. For example, the person with NPD would not set out to con a little old lady out of her life savings. However, if she offered them, the NPD would accept such a gift without reflection of its impact on her. So he or she will expect great dedication, overwork, and heroic performance from the people associated with him or her without giving any thought to the impacts of this pattern of their lives.
Wow. Okay, so the thought, like, I'd never con a little old lady. But basically, if the opportunity was there, they absolutely would. Or their thought of self-importance and grandiosity. I mean, it's so great. It pushes everything else out, including someone else's needs. Like, what do you mean you have needs? Mine aren't met. Like, there's a real infantile quality to that. Yeah, which, of course, goes hand in hand with the last criterion, and that's shows arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. So the DSM specifically says that they often display snobbish, disdainful, or patronizing attitudes. Yeah. So like the notion, like, I'm not going to talk to them because they're beneath me. The classic example of this is like Regina George from the Mean Girls movie, like this us versus them.
Or maybe like a stereotypical Karen, like, what do you mean you don't have a bidet? Like, let me talk to your manager. You're not important enough. You're beneath me.
Right. Yeah. The us versus them snobbery. So all of this is what's required for a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, which, as we've been talking about this, there's definitely more of a focus on a grandiose form of narcissism in the DSM, the peacocking, the extroversion, the showiness. But I think it's important to mention kind of the underbelly of that. So while it's not in the criteria for a diagnosis, the DSM does give honorable mention to other ways that it can present that are less kind of grandiose. Dogfish, tell me about these honorable mentions of how NPD presents.
Sure. Okay. So it can actually present in a more vulnerable form. So maybe like low self-esteem, very sensitive to criticism or failure, kind of goes hand in hand with perfectionism because basically there's an intense fear of exposure to their badness, like that failure or imperfections or like weak emotionality, because it shows their humanness and they can't handle that.
Right. So this can come out in excessive control and perfectionism, like anything to cover up the imperfections, which you wouldn't necessarily think of that as like a classic narcissistic personality disorder, but it can be. It's kind of the underbelly. And then with that, you have the internal shame, humiliation, hollowness, emptiness, insecurity, envy, kind of all of those Lego pieces that go in all in one package, right? These are the rejected internal vulnerabilities. So the person with NPD reacts to these vulnerabilities with more power, which is basically an overcompensation for the stuff they want to cover up. And that's where that control can come in for that power. I want the power back. I have to cover this up. Nobody can see. And then another reaction to these vulnerabilities, though, can actually be hiding through social withdrawal. So this is where not all facets of narcissistic personality disorder are shiny or extroverted. Facing this shame and these internal imperfections can lead to depression and emptiness, actually.
And so this also goes with impaired relationships or a history of relationship issues because there's just an overall trouble connecting with others and keeping connections because of self-absorption.
Exactly.
So maybe like a less extroverted type and a more socially withdrawn person, or the lack of connection could be because of a rejected extroverted type that other people avoid.
Exactly. Yep. I'm also just thinking kind of in a different domain that sometimes those with NPD, this can lead to like more success and professional achievements. So sometimes pathological narcissism, kind of the umbrella term, can be used and actually be helpful to climb corporate ladders, social hierarchies, etc., when it's matched with the actual talent and actual abilities. But then other times, these achievements can be interrupted by life, humanness, things like an injury, a setback, expenses, aging, that's a big one, fluctuating views of self, excess criticism, a major loss, like career or otherwise. Like those are just a few examples. But this climbing the ladder like stops working for them. The achievements stop or they're not as high. So then other times, pathological narcissism is not useful at all because that internal shame is so strong and there's a fear of being imperfect that it can actually keep somebody from taking risks at all and becoming successful. So it can go both ways. Like it can, or it can really work against the person, sometimes within the same person, like if there's major setbacks. But that makes me think about our favorite personality theorist, Dr. Theodore Milan. And I bet he has something profound to say about NPD.
Oh, absolutely. So in his book, he states, where the line should be drawn between self-confidence and healthy self-esteem versus an artificially inflated and empty sense of self-worth is not always an easy task. The healthy narcissist should demonstrate, in addition to the usual characteristics of the personality, social concerns and interpersonal empathy, a genuine interest in the ideas and feelings of others, and a willingness to acknowledge one's personal role in problematic interpersonal relationships.
Yes.
Where the disorder is present, we see a persistent insensitivity to others, a general social exploitativeness, and lack of reciprocity in everyday relationships.
Yes. Well, we have talked about the brief history of NPD with a focus on the DSM criteria specifically. So this is the criteria that Doc Fish and I use to diagnose in clinical practice. While it is uncommon that someone with NPD would present to treatment, sometimes they will, especially after a major life event or like a threat that forces them to face that inner darkness, like a major accident, job loss, divorce, those types of things. But another thing that I want to make sure to note here is that the DSM criteria does favor this more grandiose interpretation of symptoms that are extroverted in nature and more like in your face. But just like we discussed, the DSM does give a footnote to the underside of such vanity and grandiosity, which is this extreme emptiness, an actual lack of social adeptness, and more like victim-y symptoms, which we will cover those more in an upcoming episode.
Ooh, okay.
So thank you for joining us today on this episode of The Personality Couch. Make sure to check out our blogs that coincide with these episodes at www.personalitycouch.com. And as always, don't forget to give us a thumbs up or rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. And on YouTube, hit that bell so you don't miss a single episode in our Narcissism series. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on The Personality Couch.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.